This is the second recap for the cardiovascular system test over the heart. The first recap was over blood, and then watch the upcoming recap over blood vessels. Remember, the cardiovascular system has three main functions, which are transport, helping us maintain our body temperature, and defense. So, focusing on your heart is about the size of your clenched fist. It beats about 100,000 times per day and pumps about 8,000 liters of blood each day. And it's made up of our four chambers, our right and left atria, and then our right and left ventricles. So, your heart, the first thing you have to understand are the different circuits within your heart and how blood is traveling from your heart and out to different parts of your body. So, the first thing we have is our pulmonary circuit. When your heart receives deoxygenated blood or oxygen poor blood, it's going to take that blood and pump it out to your lungs. In your lungs, that blood's going to pick up oxygen and come back into your heart. That's called your pulmonary circuit, going from your heart, lungs, back to your heart. Whereas your systemic circuit has to do with your body. So now that your heart has oxygenated blood, it's going to pump it out to your body. Your body's cells and tissues are going to use that oxygen to create ATP, and then it's going to change into deoxygenated blood. Once that oxygen's dropped off, carbon dioxide gets picked up, and that deoxygenated blood is going to come back into your heart. So the systemic circuit goes from your heart to your body back to your heart. There's then different types of vessels when we're dealing with your heart. We have efferent vessels, or our arteries, and arteries carry blood away from the heart. You have afferent vessels. Afferent vessels are your veins, which are going to return blood to your heart. And then you have capillaries, which are your exchange vessels. And they're kind of like your link between your arteries and your veins. This diagram is just showing you the difference between your systemic, your body circuit, and your pulmonary circuit, which are your lungs. You need to be familiar with where your heart is located. Your heart is located within the mediastinum. The mediastinum is found within your thoracic cavity. It's right in the middle, and it's going to contain your heart and your thymus, your trachea, and your esophagus. Your heart is surrounded by a protective membrane called the pericardium. That pericardium just looks like a very thin sheet around your heart. We looked at pericardial pathologies, what happens when your pericardium gets inflamed. We then went into the anatomy of the heart, and you've seen this a lot. We did our labeling quiz, we did the heart dissection. All of this has to do with the anatomy. Be familiar with all the superficial anatomy of the heart, where it is, and what its function is. Then we got into heart histology, the tissues that make up our heart. On the outside of our heart, we have the epicardium. On the inside, like the meat portion of our heart, is the myocardium. It's our muscular walls that's forming our atria and ventricles. And then we had our endocardium, which is making up the inner surface of our atria and ventricles. It was that slick surface that we felt when we were dissecting. We then took a look at the muscles that make up the chambers of our heart. Your pectinate muscles make up your atria. The papillary heart muscle, remember, attaches to your chordae tendineae or your heartstrings, and it's going to attach to your tricuspid and bicuspid valves. When those papillary muscles contract, it pulls on the chordae tendineae, which is going to open up those valves, allowing blood to flow from your atria to your ventricles. And then you have your trabeculae carneae, which is the muscle or the ridges that make up your ventricles. Then we have our septums. The septum is on the inside of the heart, and it's a big muscular layer that's going to separate your right and left ventricles. Some heart muscle pathologies we talked about is you have your foramen ovale, which when you're a fetus and developing, your foramen ovale is a hole that lets blood flow from your right atria to your left atria without going to your lungs, because your lungs are still developing, so we need the blood to mix so our body as a fetus gets the oxygen it needs. Around 3 months, the foramen ovale is going to close up and called the fossa ovalis. If this foramen ovale does not close, it can cause serious heart defects within the child. Then we looked at our internal anatomy of our heart. You need to be familiar with the pathway of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood throughout the heart. Where deoxygenated blood flows through is represented in the blue text, and where oxygenated blood flows is represented in the red. So remember, oxygenated blood from your body, or deoxygenated blood from your body or your systemic circuit is going to come in through your vena cava. From your vena cava, it'll enter your right atria, pass through your tricuspid valve to your right ventricle. Then it will pass through the pulmonary semilunar valve, out to the pulmonary arteries, and into the lungs. In the lungs, that blood is going to pick up oxygen and it's going to come back in as oxygenated blood. It's going to enter through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, through the bicuspid valve to the left ventricle, out the aortic semilunar valve, through our aorta, and then out to our body. And then we looked at the different types of heart valves. So we have our AV valves, or your atrioventricular valves. These are where your chordae tendineae attach to. And you have your right AV valve, or your tricuspid valve, and your left AV valve, or your bicuspid valve. And then you have semilunar valves, and those semilunar valves are found between your right ventricle and your pulmonary artery, and then your left ventricle and your aorta. We took a look at different valve pathologies and what happens when our valves aren't functioning properly. We discussed our heart is an organ, and that organ needs its own blood supply in order to make ATP to contract. So our heart's arteries that are attached to it are the coronary arteries, and those arteries are supplying our heart with oxygen-rich blood. And then our heart also has to have veins on the outside, and those veins are going to take away deoxygenated blood from the heart and go get more oxygenated blood for it. We looked at different coronary diseases, coronary artery diseases. We talked about plaques, and we talked about how to diagnose them. And then we got into our heart's conducting system, how electrical signals cause your heart to beat. Your cardiac muscle cells contract, and how they do that is they receive an electrical signal that stimulates them to contract. You have your pacemaker of your heart, which is where everything begins, your sinoatrial node, or your SA node. That SA node is going to start everything off, causing your atria to contract and sending the signal down your heart to your AV node, which will eventually cause the contraction of the ventricles. You need to be familiar with the pathway of electricity through the heart. Remember, it's going to start at our pacemaker, our SA node. It is going to travel to the AV node, down the AV bundle, through the bundle branches, and then to the Purkinje fibers. And this electrical pathway is what forms our EKGs or our ECGs. So an electrocardiogram or an EKG monitors the electrical activity of our heart. And your EKG is broken up into 3 waves. Your P waves, which are the depolarization of your atria before they're contracting. Your QRS complex, which is your spike, which is a depolarization of the ventricles before they contract. And then the T wave, which is your ventricles repolarizing or relaxing. So this diagram is showing you your P, QRS, and T waves and what's happening in each. You have several of those diagrams to look at. And then we took a look at what was happening if our EKGs were abnormal. So you can have bradycardia, which is a slow heart rate, tachycardia, which is a fast heart rate, or arrhythmia, which is an irregular heart rate. We talked about to listen to our heart, we use a stethoscope, and to measure our blood pressure, we use a sphygmometer. And that's all for the heart. So with the heart, make sure you know the parts of the heart, the internal and external structures. Make sure you know the layers of muscle, how electricity is ran through the heart. And then watch your next video over blood vessels.